The Inquisition swept like a plague across medieval Europe. It was without question one of the darkest and bloodiest episodes in human history. A time when thousands of people accused of heresy by the Catholic Church were arrested, tried, and put to death.
It was ethnic cleansing on a huge scale. It was one faith trying to exterminate another.
There were Inquisition tribunals going on all over the country. It really was a people living in fear.
This religious fanaticism spread to Tudor England, where Catholics and Protestants did their best to wipe each other out. The persecution continued in the 18th century when countless ordinary women were drowned or burned at the stake after they were accused of being witches.
1/3 of the entire population was accused of heresy and witchcraft by the other 2/3.
The Christians were actually aiming to stamp out something that had been in place for thousands of years before then. This was a war on magic and witchcraft, but what it really was a war on people that couldn't fight back.
The world lived in the shadow of Inquisition and persecution for over 500 years. You would think we would have learned our lesson.
Thousands of heretics in this country died under the knife, the axe, or in the flames.
The witch hunts that terrorized parts of the 16th and 17th century England took place in an atmosphere of near hysteria. We look at the campaigns against Satan in this episode of Inquisition.
Thousands upon thousands of women were executed in this country for their beliefs, purely and simply because they were on the wrong side of the accepted religion of this country at the time. For me, it was one of the darkest periods of England's history.
In the year 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued a decree authorizing the correcting, imprisoning, punishing and chastising of women who were devil worshippers. He did so largely at the urging of two German inquisitors, Ulrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. Having attacked the Cathars, the Templars, the Jews and the Muslims, the Holy Inquisition now found itself a new target: witches. Witches were believed to have made a covenant with the devil, a crime considered so foul that it fell outside all normal legal procedures. In 1487, Kramer and Sprenger published their notorious Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of the Witches, which was nothing less than a do-it-yourself guide to finding, torturing, and executing witches.
The Malleus was the first DIY manual for witchcraft. It really provided three things. The first was evidence that witchcraft existed. Second, insight into how to identify a witch. And thirdly, how do I prosecute one?
The witch hunting craze started really in the early 13th century, again trying to stamp out paganism. And Dominican priests, again, were appointed as witch finders, witch hunters. Two particularly nasty ones in Germany, Kramer and Sprenger, who wrote a book, The Hammer of the Witches, Malleus Maleficarum. And that was the Bible, if you like, for witch hunting. And, of course, in Europe, the witches were tormented terribly, tortured very badly, and burnt at the stake. But over in this country, we weren't so bad. We were more lenient with them. And then it became a capital offence under Queen Elizabeth. And that became a hanging offence. So we actually stopped burning witches over here. They were no longer considered heretics, but it was a capital offence, and so they were hanged.
Although the Inquisition had tried witches across Europe during the 14th and 15th centuries, the mania for hunting them down didn't really gather pace until the 1600s. To modern eyes, it was an extraordinary business that had very little to do with justice or legality.
The whole witch-finding era was nonsensical, was crazy. All it was, you know, you wanted the cottage that the old lady still lived in. You owed the baker some money. You didn't like the old woman that lived down the road. You wanted to get rid of your wife. You wanted to get rid of your girlfriend. You wanted to get rid of your husband. And so you would make up some nonsensical stories that they would creep out in the middle of the night, and down at the bottom of the garden would be a hare that suddenly turned into a demonical figure and had sex with them at the bottom of the garden. All manner of absolute nonsense that went on in those days, but went on for the best part of, well, the last witch was hanged in this country in the early 1700s.
I've been accused and found guilty. Parliament and our Lord protects us shall be taken from this earth and dispatched by way of hanging.
Dr. Alison Rowlands of Essex University is an expert on witchcraft during this period, and she thinks that the very real belief in magic and sorcery at the time helped to create an atmosphere of fear.
At this time, in the 16th and 17th centuries, most people believed in magic. It was just part of everyday life. People believed in the supernatural, in God, but also in the possibility of magical intervention in everyday life. And in that context, it made a lot of sense to think that some people could use magic for harmful purposes. So it's not really hysterical or unreasonable if you live in that world and have those beliefs. And so I think what's different about the 16th and 17th century is you get the men in power, the kings, the lawmakers, the church. They begin to get very concerned about witchcraft as a new form of heresy, as a new form of sin against God, with this belief that witches were actually in league with the devil. So I think part of what drives the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th century is actually a kind of a top-down concern on the part of the authorities that the witch is something more terrifying than before.
The witch hunts get going in England in the 1560s because that's when a law against witches is brought in. The idea you must hunt witches arrives from the continent of Europe big time. And what you do then is you arrest about one person a year, occasionally a bunch of them, and try them. And 80% of them are acquitted. So you need to be senile or mad or have an incredible number of influential local enemies to get executed. But then comes the English Civil War in the 1640s, and the whole traditional system of law courts collapses. And into the vacuum steps a young man suffering from TB called Matthew Hopkins, who claims to know how to detect witches. And he and a scratch squad of witch hunters go through East Anglia, hot knives through butter, inviting the communities to bring out their suspects. He then tortures them into confession. And so probably over a quarter of the total number of people executed for witchcraft in England die in one summer, thanks to Matthew Hopkins' witch hunt. So it depends where you look. Most of the time, the English are pretty restrained about putting people to death for witchcraft. But once the usual checks are gone, they're as mad about killing witches as anybody else.
There's the biggest irony, as new kids on the block, the Christians were actually aiming to stamp out something that had been in place for thousands of years before them, and that had been a completely natural way of life. You know, these people were pagan. They celebrated nature, the harvest, their children, death, rebirth, all aspects that were important to them in life. And then they were being asked to just believe in this person they'd never seen. They just had to go on somebody's word. And in order to do that, they terrorised an entire nation to achieve that.
Step back,
Matthew Hopkins operated mainly in Essex, Norfolk and Suffolk in the early part of the 17th century. Such was his success at finding and punishing witches, he was given the title of Witch Finder General. It's believed that Hopkins was responsible for the execution of more than 300 women.
Restrain her.
Hopkins is a fanatic. I mean, he's not in it for the money. He's a young minor gentleman with some training in law who's raised his consciousness and got born again. He really does believe that Satan is out to get the English, and he, Matthew, has been told by God to stop him. So he asks people, who are your local witches? Women are arrested and handed over to him. He then deprives them of sleep for nights on end. He ties them in ways that makes their muscles scream, and these two things together break them. They then confess as he wants, and he hands them over to the local vigilantes who put them to death.
Matthew Hopkins made loads of money identifying witches and making sure they were persecuted. The number of witches that were identified during his 3 or 4 year period of witch finding absolutely dwarfed all the other witch persecutions that had taken place for hundreds of years previously. He was a one-man witch extermination crew.
Bring them all to the river.
Some people think witch finders were only motivated by a desire for profit. I actually think that's doing them a slight injustice. I wouldn't want to defend what they did, but I think they were genuinely committed to the persecution of what they saw as the devil's creatures. And at some level, they actually thought that they were doing a public and godly service to the communities of Essex and East Anglia by helping to hunt witches.
Come on, get him!
Women who were accused of being witches were often rounded up en masse before being interrogated and tried. One of Matthew Hopkins' last surviving witches' prisons is today part of a 17th century house in the small village of St Osyth in Essex. Its current owner is convinced that the witches who were imprisoned there still haunt the house today.
Through here is the prison room, which was called the cage. This is a room where many prisoners would have been chained up and chained to these walls. There was up to probably 13, 14 prisoners in this small room. That had been chained to the walls, men, women and children. And obviously most famous for Ursula Kemp and the famous witch trials of St Osyth. The witches would have been kept in here before they were taken off for trial and eventually, in some cases, execution. Now, here is the downstairs toilet. One evening, my partner Ross had been actually drilling underneath this because we understood there was a cellar. We found out there's space underneath this hole, so we got a long drill bit and actually drilled underneath. We discovered it was empty space. So a bit later, I was sitting on the toilet and I heard the most deep, loud scratch, and it felt like fingers, and it came from somewhere within this cupboard space. And I sat there and I thought, oh my God, you know, obviously first instinct is to run out, but I couldn't. Then after 30 seconds, it happened again, louder, and it was a real deep. And it didn't sound like a scratch on a tile or anything like that. It was definitely coming from that cupboard, and it felt like it was coming from underneath. And obviously it was terrifying. It was a really scary experience. I actually left the house and refused to come back in.
The St. Osyth witch trials of 1582 caused a sensation at the time. Over a period of several days, groups of local women accused of practicing witchcraft were brought before the rural court. One of the local women who was arrested and kept in the witch cage was Ursula Kemp, a local healer and herbalist, who was accused by the village of placing curses upon her enemies. As was usual, she was accused mostly on the basis of hearsay and malicious gossip, but nonetheless, Kemp was interrogated by Hopkins, put on trial, found guilty, and sent to the gallows. Vanessa believes that Ursula's ghost still haunts the house today.
I definitely feel that there is women entities of those days. I couldn't tell you if her name's Ursula, the ladies, but I've seen one particular lady when she walked through and she was carrying a bowl with some type of leaves or potpourri, something similar to potpourri. She looked like the witches would have looked like, or the women would have looked like in those days. There's definitely 100% that there's entities here from those days, without a doubt. I truly believe that. Whether it's her or not, I don't know. But there's definitely women here from those days.
You have been accused of consorting with spirits at midnight.
No, they're all right.
The cage at St. Osyth wouldn't just have had accused witches in it. It was a small local lockup for anybody accused of misdemeanours in the community. It was a way of keeping them safe to be questioned by the authorities before they were taken into formal custody in Colchester Castle. So most reasonably sized towns would have had some place like that or some designated space where people could have been kept under lock and key. But it wouldn't have just been witches, it would have been other criminals as well.
In common with the Inquisition in France and Spain, local people soon came to realise that accusing somebody of witchcraft was a rather neat way of dealing with people that you didn't like. An inconvenient mistress or a troublesome neighbour suddenly became much less of a problem if she had to deny she was a witch.
If you were a woman, it was almost impossible not to be accused of being a witch. I mean, if you spoke out of line to your husband, if you looked inappropriately at an official, if you were just too intelligent for your own good, the conclusion, you're a witch.
The classic suspected witch is somebody who is antisocial. They have a vicious tongue. They curse people anyway. They make people feel uneasy. It's entirely possible that some of the people who are accused of witchcraft actually did believe they had the power to make people suffer by cursing them. It's not a reason for putting them to death in modern terms, but it would close the cycle of suspicion pretty well completely.
Going up to the woods and collecting ingredients.
Merely herbs for dinner.
I think thousands of women were probably totally innocent of the crimes against them, really. Women were persecuted, there's no two ways about it. And in some cases, whether you were innocent or guilty, you'd still lose your life in the form of ducking stools in cold water, etc., etc. It's absolutely amazing to think that we had to wait into the early part of the last century for women to actually get the right to vote.
I think the period of the witch hunts probably does make life more difficult for women. Even women who never get accused, there's always that risk of accusation. So I think if you're particularly abrasive, particularly independent, particularly feisty, particularly successful as well, people can get quite jealous of that. And so I think if you stand out from the crowd, then you could be at risk of accusation. So I think women probably did actually have to change their behaviour. I think as a woman at that time, just being completely mediocre and keeping your head down was probably the best option.
It was not me, I didn't do it.
Witchcraft is still practiced in England today, with more than 2,000 women up and down the country still claiming to be witches. Diane Narroway is one of these, and she's in no doubt that thousands of innocent women were wrongly put to death during the 17th century.
The sort of women they accused were generally healers, herbalists, old ladies that had nobody else to support them, often beggars, and of course, you know, husbands and wives or friends were pointing the finger at you know, their neighbour or their partner in order to, like, gain their land and estate. You know, it was absolutely brutal. Nobody was actually, like, kind of safe, because this was a war on magic and witchcraft, but what it really was a war on people that couldn't fight back.
Diane runs a pagan group called the Dolmen Grove, which is based in Portland, in Dorset. Its members are made up of men, women and children from all walks of life, including council workers, police officers and chefs. And they meet regularly at a stone circle on the cliffs high above the sea. There they celebrate the ancient pagan festival days and equinoxes, and use drums, chants and rituals to invoke spirits which they say connect them to the energy of nature's forces.
The majority of circles in paganism these days focus around the idea of creation and death and rebirth. Out here we've had midsummer circles which focus on, like, you know, the new life, the summer months, the goddess reigning over them. Also, we've had hand fastings out here where people have got married. This is the central altar, and this is where couples will stand for hand fastings, or people would bring their children for naming ceremonies. If it is a normal sort of Wheel of the Year ritual, then the people that are leading the ceremony, which would normally in this case be myself and Talak, we'd have a brazier on here to burn incense, and then it moves out to the inner circle. If there's only a few people here, then we'll only use the inner circle. But for larger gatherings, then we can, like, pull it out to the outer circle. And when we have hand fastings, the couple come down to the outer circle, they are greeted, then they move closer to the inner circle, and then they move eventually into here.
For Diane, to be a witch today is to be part of an ancient spiritual tradition, with roots that can be traced back thousands of years before the arrival of Christianity.
A natural spiritual way of life that focuses on the elements and their surroundings has existed since the beginning of mankind. Thousands, millions of years before the Catholic Church ever thought about setting foot on British soil. And for all its attempts in the Middle Ages, there are still witches and still pagans here now practicing today. And there will still be witches and pagans practicing here long after the Catholic Church is gone and long after organised religion has collapsed.
In Stuart, England, witches were believed to be possessed by the devil, and as the devil himself was unlikely to confess, it was the witch who had to do it.
You are accused of practicing witchcraft. You will be lowered into the river. If the river rejects you, you are indeed a witch. However, if the river consumes you, you may be innocent. Do you have any last words?
Although torture was technically unlawful in England, witchfinder Matthew Hopkins often used techniques such as sleep deprivation to extract confessions from his victims. This was only one of a number of tried and tested methods employed by Hopkins to spot a witch. Another was to cut the arm of the accused. If no blood was drawn, it was, according to Hopkins, a sure sign of a witch. So he used a blunt knife.
Lower her in.
Historian Richard Felix has made a study of some of the torture techniques used by Hopkins.
If you were accused of being a witch, probably a woman, remember this would probably be your 80-year-old grandmother. She'd be brought to a place like this, a pond in the village, for swimming. This is reputedly the remains of a pond that was used for witches. They were filled in, because remember, these places were considered to be cursed. I don't want to go too far in, just in case there's still some water in it. What then happened was, of course, the whole village would be here. The accusers would be here. Matthew Hopkins would probably be here. Your right thumb would be tied to your left toe. Your left thumb tied to your right toe, and you'd then be hunched up, and they would literally throw you into the middle of the pond. There'd be a gasp from everybody as the old girl sank into the water, and then everyone would be waiting to see what happened. If you sank, you were innocent, because you'd accepted baptism of water. But of course, if you rose from the water, you were a witch, and you were obviously opposed against baptism. Once you'd risen, you were definitely a witch. There'd probably be a loud cheer from the crowd, and I should think probably a loud cheer from Matthew Hopkins, who would get more money for this, of course. You would then be taken out, and of course they'd hang you. So just imagine the scene. We've got 17th and 18th century England. We've got bands of marauding witch finders around the country, people accusing each other of witchcraft, people being swum in ponds like this one, some of them drowning, some of them being taken out and hanged. People absolutely terrified in the village that someone was going to accuse them, because England was gripped in this dreadful witch-finding craze.
There are various illegal ways of detecting witches. One is that you search them for the devil's mark on their bodies. And this does happen sometimes, where the professional judges aren't out and aren't keeping an eye on things. And there's one which never gets into the law courts, and that's the idea that you test a would-be witch or a suspected witch by throwing her, sometimes him, into water, and if they sink, the water receives them, then they're innocent, and if the water rejects them, then they're guilty. They've got ropes on them, so if they sink, they are hauled out alive. They don't drown. No sane person regards this as a good test. It's never made legal, but mobs do it.
It's an incredibly brutal thing to do. Incredibly horrible. I mean, the amount of water they take into their lungs, quite a few of them just died anyway in the process.
It got absolutely crazy with the accusations. Everybody was being accused of a witch. If you had a feud with another family in town, guess what? They're going to accuse you of being a witch. Anybody who had any sort of grudge, the witch finders sought them out. This is how they got their list. This is how they got their commission. If it wasn't so tragic, it would be comical.
Matthew Hopkins and his witch-finding assistants continued to scour the country looking for suspected witches and devising some ingenious ways to spot them. One telltale sign was something known as the devil's mark. This was a skin defect, supposedly common to all witches, that was said to be dead to feeling and which wouldn't bleed. Although in reality it was usually a simple mole, a birthmark, or a skin blemish.
Torture was illegal in 17th century England, but Matthew Hopkins devised his own forms of torturous methods to find out if you're a witch, other than the water torture, and that was called pricking. They believed in those days that the witch bore the devil's mark, which was either an extra teat or a mole, and they believed that that mark would not bleed if pricked or cut. And Hopkins created a knife with a retractable blade that when he stuck it into the devil's mark, of course, no blood came out. And she was a witch and was condemned to death. We didn't burn witches in 17th century England. We hanged them. The rope was either thrown over the bough of a tree. This is rough justice in the village. Or, of course, it would be the county gallows in the town at the top of a hill. We're not talking of a broken neck and a trapdoor. We're talking of slow strangulation. She was either stood on a stool or there was a ladder going up to the bough of the tree. She climbed up there, the rope was put around her neck and tightened, and then the executioner would turn the ladder or kick the stool away. Her hands were tied in front of her, not at the back, and her legs were free. And it would take her anything up to a quarter of an hour to die of slow strangulation. Kicking, writhing, choking, vomiting, unless she had a kindly executioner. And then he would grab hold of her legs and pull down, which of course tightened the rope around the neck and strangled her quicker.
Records show that Hopkins and his retinue were well paid for their work. He charged on average some 20 shillings per town, although Stowmarket in Suffolk paid him £47, nearly £7,000 in today's money. Ipswich was even more generous. It paid him £50 for his services, more than £10,000 today. Hunting witches was clearly very good business.
Matthew Hopkins became a famous, notorious witch finder, and towns and even sometimes villages paid Matthew Hopkins to travel to their part of the country as a witch finder, and they paid him handsomely to find as many witches as he could. So, of course, he found as many witches as he could, and they were hanged, and he was paid.
Matthew Hopkins' motivation was clearly money. He was highly commissioned. He and his associate, John Stern, and the women who did the ducking and the pricking, they were all paid handsomely. So, needless to say, when they came into a town, they found what they were looking for because they were paid on commission. There's one classic example. Was when he goes into Ipswich, he finds so many witches that the town has to levy a new tax just to pay his commission.
Matthew Hopkins had failed as a lawyer, but had kind of discovered that he could actually set himself up as a witchfinder general and could charge exorbitant amounts of money to the townspeople to rid them of witches. And purely it was a way of lining his pockets. He took women with him that performed pricking and, you know, obviously were quite clever about it, and they had to earn their cut, and John Stern, who was with him, earned his cut. And I think between them, they made a fortune. They absolutely kind of, like, made loads on the back of, like, the potential witches in the parishes of, like, Britain. But at the end of the day, you know, he was responsible for the majority of trials and deaths around that time in this country, you know. He tried something ridiculous. I think he was responsible for 300 of 500 deaths or something, with a lot more trials.
You have been found guilty and condemned as witch.
Lowestoft in Suffolk was the scene of another set of infamous witch trials in the mid-17th century. Here a group of local girls were accused of cursing townsfolk. Bad enough, but even worse when several of those who had been cursed suddenly died. Local historian and author Ivan Bunn takes up the story.
Yeah, I have a book here, which is, in actual fact, the second edition of the account of the trial of the Lowestoft witches, and it's from this we were able to get all the information that, which are the bones, if you like, of the trial. From that, we were able to pull out all the local history details and flesh out these bones and bring these people back to life. Because the big question is, were they guilty or not? And that depends on where you're coming from. The laws were there in place, which meant technically they were guilty of the crimes that they were being accused of by society. In the eyes of the law, they were guilty. But obviously, unless you actually believe in the existence of witches and witchcraft, we know that they couldn't possibly have done the things that they were accused of. So Was it a miscarriage of justice? Certainly by today's standards it was, but certainly by the standards of that day, it probably wasn't considered to be a miscarriage of justice, and society would have seen the full panoply of the law kicking in and bringing these two wanton women to their just ends.
First a child, and he died. There's been too many deaths in the village.
Somewhere in here I've actually got the original indictments of the trial. These are the Latin indictments, all 14 of them, which were produced at the trial, and they are interesting for two reasons. First of all, they're actually all in Latin, and along the top of each of the indictments, the clerk of the court is recorded in shorthand Latin exactly what's happening. So he tells us that they pleaded not guilty. He's telling us they're guilty now. And at the end, he's written suspende per column, which means hanged by the neck. So this is actually effectively records the end of a human life. This was a brutal punishment, and quite often the people never, their necks weren't broken at all, but there is records of them actually choking to death, hanging at the end of a rope, urinating and defecating, and in some cases, in public hangings, a member of the family, if the person was suffering, would run out of the crowd and swing on the feet of the person being hanged to hasten the end. It was brutal.
Naturally, the witch-finder General Matthew Hopkins also cut a swathe through Suffolk, charging each town and village handsomely as he went. Ivan has studied the local records and discovered the true extent of Hopkins' ill-gotten gains.
Matthew Hopkins published a small booklet justifying what he was doing. He says in his booklet that he never charged more than £1, no matter where he went, no matter how many witches he found or didn't find, and out of that he had to pay for his horses and his accommodation. We know, for instance, from the records of King's Lynn in Norfolk, where he visited, his first visit, he was paid £15 because it shows up in the town accounts. The same in Stowmarket, it cost the town over £47 to employ him, board and lodgings, his charges. The same thing happened to Aldborough in Suffolk. Again, he says he only charged £1. We know for a fact that he was paid over £4, and also a lot more money was expended on his board and lodgings. I could go on. Great Yarmouth, there is another example. He might be a Christian, he might be a nonconformist, but when you read his book and hear what he says about what he was paid, then you see from the actual accounts of what he was paid, he was a liar.
For me, there are no such things as witches. They were nothing more than the wise one of the village, the healer. Thousands upon thousands of women were executed in this country for their beliefs, purely and simply because they were on the wrong side of the accepted religion of this country at the time. For me, it was one of the darkest periods of England's history.
Bring them to the river.
The witch hunts of the Middle Ages remain a dark stain on British history, in as much as at the time they actually caused such fear in people. Can you imagine, like, you know, you never knew if somebody was going to knock on your door, accuse you of being a witch, take you off, stick pins in you, duck you, torture you. I mean, they sat them on burning stools, a variety of horrific things. And all of that just to gain, you know, that people were subservient to that one religion. They refused to, they walked away from their old ways. And that stain still stands. As I said, like in other countries, the burning times aren't over.
As the years passed, the witch hunt madness in England slowly abated, until it was eventually outlawed by the Witchcraft Act of 1735. The Holy Inquisition in Europe would formally be abolished in the early 1800s, after the Emperor Napoleon invaded Spain with his armies. So after 600 years of trials, torture and executions, Europe moved into the new century free from the threat of religious persecution. Well, almost. In 1900, the Vatican tried to distance itself a little from its brutal past. It changed the name of the Inquisition to the Holy Office, and later to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. This was put under the control of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who was later to become Pope Benedict XVI.
The Inquisition has never really gone away, let's be honest. It's just rebranded itself. Clearly, they're up to their old tricks. While they're not slaughtering towns in France, they are going after the Da Vinci Code. They're going after Harry Potter. The prejudice is still alive and well in Rome.
Inquisition no longer exists. It was abolished, and the local Inquisitions in most European states no longer exist, but the original one at Rome certainly does exist. It's there to identify wrong belief. It has taken on Harry Potter, unbelievably. It's condemned the Da Vinci Code a lot more understandably. And it's lost its power to kill people. It's lost its power to arrest people who don't buy into its basic premises. But it is there as a force to help define right beliefs for Roman Catholics. And in that more or less harmless form, I suppose in a world of free speech, it has the rights that everybody else has.
About 10 years ago, the Vatican opened up its archives in an attempt to prove that the Inquisition was nowhere near as bad, nowhere near as brutal as history tells us it actually was. It's really a pathetic attempt at retroactively doing damage control. I mean, try telling the people of Béziers and Madrid that it wasn't as bad as you think it was. They should be ashamed of themselves.
The Inquisitions that began in the 13th century and that engulfed most of Europe have cast a dark shadow over half a millennia of human history. It's estimated that during that time, more than 1 million people became the victims of the bloody campaigns against heresy, treason, and witchcraft. But it's a sad postscript to the story that religious and ethnic persecution still carries on to this day.
The world lived in the shadow of Inquisition and persecution for over 500 years. You would think we would have learned our lesson. But look at Bosnia, look at Iraq, look at Syria. The persecution, the ethnic cleansing, the death, it continues.